Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Stephen King Cast, one man's musings on the works of Stephen King.
Each week I'll review one entry in the bibliography of Stephen King in the chronological order of publication, except for this week. This week I'm jumping to the front of the line, or the back of the line, depending on how you look at it, because this is a special week, as you probably know. And if you don't know, then this past Tuesday, November 11th, 2014, Stephen King published his latest book, Revival, which was a fantastic book, and I cannot wait to get into it with everyone. But at this point, he has published nearly 70 novels and more novels than the amount of years that he's been alive on this earth, which is awesome. Now, last week on the review, I published the Cujo movie review, and so I apologize anyone tuning in who thought they were going to be getting the first part of the Gunslinger review. Just so you know, when I record these episodes, I'm about 8 to 10 episodes in advance, so that's about 8 to 10 weeks, actually. So I never knew exactly when I was recording an episode when that would correspond to Revival coming out. So at the time of the Cujo review, or the Cujo movie review, I knew the next thing I would be reviewing, in terms of recording, would be The Gunslinger. But then this came out, and I really wanted to make sure that I got this review out very, very quickly after the publication itself, because that's when the discourse is happening, and I wanted to be part of the discourse, and I wanted to just put my thoughts out there to anyone that wanted to listen, especially to everyone that has been listening. And again, I'll never be able to thank all of you enough. So maybe you wanted to hear my thoughts about it, so I really wanted to put it out. So those of you who are waiting for The Gunslinger, don't worry, it's coming, it's recorded, it's ready to go. So it's just going to be dropping next week, instead of this week. But this was an interesting experience for me. I'm going to talk about Revival, don't get me wrong, for the rest of the podcast, but I do want to take a moment just to describe when it comes to a new Stephen King book. As I've said earlier in podcast episodes, I first started reading Stephen King. The first book that I read was It, and I was in 6th grade, and after 6th grade, I voraciously devoured everything that he had written up until that point. So, for me, reading Stephen King, it didn't include new Stephen King novels. The first new Stephen King novel that came out was, I believe, if I'm getting the order correct, I think it was Nightmares and Dreamscapes. And I remember specifically looking at like a magazine ad in the dentist's office for Nightmares and Dreamscapes, and I didn't know anything about it at the point. All it said, coming soon from the Master of Horror or whatever, Nightmares and Dreamscapes by Stephen King, out, whenever, October, let's just say, or September, when it was. And for those of you who haven't seen the hardcover edition of Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which is a short story collection that has some of my favorite Stephen King short stories, actually. It's a great cover. It's a scarecrow staked into the middle of the road, and everything about it, to me, I got a real autumn feel from it. It felt very Halloweenish to me. So I was really excited about it, and I wasn't in the mood for short stories when it came out, so I was a little disappointed. But that cover, and what that cover represented to me, I'm never going to forget, because it just represented the possibility of a new experience that Stephen King could provide to me, and I didn't know what he would be able to give to me, but I was so excited for it. And then I distinctly remember when Insomnia came out, and that was when I was full on a Dark Tower fanatic. So when that novel came out, and for those of you who haven't read Insomnia, it gets a bad rap. It gets a really bad rap. It's a really good book. And if you like the Dark Tower series, it's even better. But if you don't like the Dark Tower series, there's still what is going on in that book is crazy and terrifying, and the imagery within that novel is astounding. So if you haven't read Insomnia, I strongly recommend Insomnia. And I remember I could not wait for Insomnia. And then Insomnia came out, and I ate it up completely. I loved the experience of reading Insomnia. And that was one of the last times I remember really. I think that was kind of more at the tail end of the first phase of my Stephen King reading career. Because after that, I was getting older. I was growing up. I was reading more classic literature, I guess you would say, with a capital L. And I was just reading other things. I had different interests, and I was still reading, but that level of fanaticism I don't think can sustain itself for very long. So I distinctly remember, when Bag of Bones came out, I was interested, but not to the level that I had been before. And I think that the last time my excitement for a Stephen King novel matched the experience of reading a Stephen King novel probably was Black House, which came at a different phase in my Stephen King career. One that I was kind of, I don't know, not burned out. I wasn't burned out, but the fire had died a little bit. I think that Dreamcatcher had come out before, and I didn't know Dreamcatcher was coming. And I remember going to the grocery store, seeing the book on display on the shelves, being like, oh my God, I didn't realize that there was a new Stephen King book coming out. I read the cover, and I was like, oh wow, aliens. He's going to go into aliens. Got, like 4 friends, in the woods on a hunting with aliens. That sounds great. It was not great. Not a good book. It was very disappointing. I think that kind of burned me a little bit. Black House came out. Black House is great. Black House to me, and it's not just a Stephen King book, it's also a Peter Straub book. But to me, it feels like a return to form of Stephen King's earlier books. And I'm really looking forward to getting back into Black House. So it's not just a return to the world of the Talisman, but it's also a return to a Stephen King story that doesn't really exist anymore. So I was really happy, really, really happy with Black House. And for those of you who are Dark Tower fans, to me, Black House is the last pure Dark Tower novel. To me, it is a full-on Dark Tower novel. And it's the last Dark Tower novel in the vein of the Dark Tower novels before he released Wolves with a Collar. And then there were novels that I wasn't into in the next phase, the phase of the loyal reader. I was a constant reader. I'll always be a constant reader, but I just wasn't as passionate about what I was reading. Lisey's Story, I'm not a huge fan of. I liked Cell. Cell's good, but I wasn't, I couldn't wait. It wasn't that. Doomakey, I wasn't really invested in, and especially with Lisey's Story and Doomakey, these I realized that these these are not stories, and when he had written these, I was in my early 20s. They're not stories for an early 20s guy. They're stories for someone in their middle age, later in life. And I have no doubt that when I go back, when I'm older, there's a lot that I'm going to be able to pick up on that I didn't pick up on when I first read it, because it's not where I needed to be in my life to fully grasp what he was tackling with. So I fully understand that, but from a reading experience, I wasn't necessarily feeling it. Dr. Sleep, there was Full Dark No Stars, there was Dr. Sleep, there was Mr. Mercedes. Went out, I bought them all on the day they came out. And I wasn't really, really plugged in the way that I used to. And I say all this because this year, with the podcast I've been putting out, it's got me back into Stephen King in a way. I never left Stephen King, but going back to his works, reading them again in the chronological order of publication, and talking about it, and talking about all the Kingisms, and talking about, what I believe, the thesis of his book is about how he believes in humanity as an optimistic writer, and seeing all the tricks and traits and tropes and all of his great character work and his ability to just really paint a scene, his beautiful imagery, his mastery at tone, his humor, even though I make fun of it a lot, but I mean, he's funny. He's a funny writer. His appreciation of music, his authenticity, all of that, just embracing all of it and diving into all of it, it made me so excited when I knew that there was a new Stephen King book coming out. And I remember in late August, early September, I remember posting something on Instagram. It was the cover of Revival. It was released, and I realized that for the first time in a long time, I could not wait for this book to come out. I couldn't wait. And the day before it came out on Monday night, I felt like it was Christmas. I knew that I was going to wake up and there was going to be this experience that I was going to be able to be a part of. I was going to go to Barnes & Noble, and I was going to get the book, and I was going to read a new Stephen King story through the lens of a new phase in my Stephen King life. And that was, hosting the Stephen King cast. And it was just a crazy experience to me. Because he's always been there, and then now there's another part of Stephen King when it comes to reading a Stephen King book, and it's what you're listening to. It's I guess an interactive experience, and everything that he has done up until this point has allowed me to be able to look at his books in a more critical lens and weigh his books against his other works. And I was just really excited at just reading a book by Stephen King that I have no context for. I have no previous associations with. It was just going to be new. And I was just really excited and a little challenged because I didn't know if I was going to be able to get it done in time for the weekend, which is when I was going to release the review. So there was just a lot. There was just a lot there. And then I went down to Barnes & Noble and I picked it up. And I picked it up along with the new Special Agent Pendergast book, for those of you who are Pendergast fans. If you haven't read any of the Pendergast novels, please, I know it's the Stephen King cast, but if I was going to do another podcast about authors, I would definitely do the Pendergast novels. What the Pendergast novels are, they are novels written by Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child. And in the late 90s, there was an awful movie, The Relic, that came out, and that is the first novel in the Pendergast books. And the movie didn't even include the character. But if you like Special Agent Dale Cooper from Twin Peaks, if you like the Doctor from Doctor Who, if you like Sherlock Holmes, if you like that brilliant detective set in this crazy thriller, then you're going to love the Pendergast books. They're so much fun, and so I can't wait to finish this podcast episode, because as soon as I'm done, I am going to begin reading Blue Labyrinth. I cannot wait. So it was as a book reader, it was a really good day for me, Tuesday, November the 11th. I apologize for the snoring that you hear in the background. One of my dogs is being extremely needy, and she needs to be curled up right next to me. So I apologize if you hear snoring. It's my pug, one of my two pugs, making her presence known. But anyway, going back to the experience, I was so excited. And I'm excited to be able to share my thoughts about Revival. So here we go. Typically right now, I would read the Wikipedia summary so I could have a foundation upon which I could build my analysis. But when I checked Wikipedia, no one's written a summary yet. So I mean, this episode, of course, like any episode, and I've never put out a spoiler disclaimer, which clearly I should. It's just I was under the assumption that anyone listening to the episodes would have read the books. But seriously, if you haven't read Revival, don't listen to this until you've read Revival. Then you can hear my thoughts. But if you have read Revival, then it's fresh in your minds, so you don't need the Wikipedia summary. And eventually the day will come when I will catch up to the chronological order of publication, and I will re-release this episode with a Wikipedia summary and maybe a second part where I talk about how I feel about it the second time around. But before actually I get into the specifics of the review of Revival, the book that I was reading. So I picked it up on Tuesday. Right now, as I'm recording this, it's Wednesday. So I finished it pretty much. I read most of it last night. I finished it just a little while ago. But so picked it up Tuesday, read it all day Tuesday. On Monday, I was halfway through reading Pet Sematary. So Pet Sematary is firmly in my mind, and when I'm done with this, I'm gonna go read the Pendergast novel and not Stephen King for a while, which is good for me. And then I will finish Pet Sematary and then record the review and then continue onward from there. But I'm right now, I'm still immersed in all of the themes from Pet Sematary. It's very fresh in my mind, and I don't know if it's because of it's so close to me right now, because I put it down and I picked up Revival. But to me, this is very much the spiritual successor to Pet Sematary. Completely. I mean, you just think about it here. Both novels are just basically, they're just Stephen King's view of looking at death. All right, Pet Sematary that's what it is. Up until that point, Stephen King was, he was writing his books and publishing, and people are going, getting scared, and they loved it. But, make no mistake, his books were always about something. Carrie was about, the horrors of humanity against humanity, in the form of bullying. Salem's Lot was about the small town being invaded by forces outside from the larger world. The Shining is about substance abuse. It's about, just physical abuse. It's really about abuse, right? So there's all of those things. Pet Sematary was his first, and I'm going to definitely get into this when we get into the Pet Sematary review. But in the meantime, here's a little taste. Pet Sematary is it's all about death. It's just death saturates every single page. It's the first time, and of course he has, had death in his novels. He's a horror novelist. You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs, right? So, but this is the first time he actually stares death in the face and says, I'm going to really spend some time with you, and I'm really going to try and understand you, and I'm going to put out all of my thoughts that I have on you onto this page. And that's what Pet Sematary is about, and that's exactly what Revival is about. Both about death. It's about there's just the secret power hiding behind the facade of our world. In Pet Sematary, it's about the power that lies within the Micmac burial ground. Here, it's about the secret power that hides behind the lightning. Both the major turning point, the story plot point that pushes the rest of the story forward, revolve around the loss of a family. Both novels involve the resurrection of the dead, the corruption of good, the fear of death. Both have the relationship between a man and his father figure. So they are spiritual novels. They are joined. But the huge difference here, I would say the huge difference is in Pet Sematary. Stephen King wrote it, I think, when he was around 36, which is the same age of Louis Creed, the main character. When Stephen King wrote Revival, he's in his late 60s, right? So Pet Sematary is an examination of death through the eyes of a young man, and Revival is an examination of death through the eyes of an older man. In Pet Sematary, the biggest fear, for someone alive is death. Because when you're in your 30s, life, you start to get a glimpse of a finite nature to your life, but you have so much life left. So the idea of it snuffing out, that's enough of a fear. However, Stephen King at this point in his life, he's been touched by death. He's closer to it. He lives with it a little bit more than I think that the rest of us do, as anyone does at a particular age, because there's stages in life. There's the stage, right, where all of your friends get married, right? Then there's a stage where all of your friends have kids. Then there's the stage where your friends start to die and you go to a lot of funerals. And so around that age, it's kind of where he's starting to be. So he's spending more time with it. So at the stage that he's at now, it's not surprising that whereas when he was a younger man, the fear of death was death itself. As an older man, the fear of death is not death itself, all right, but it's about the existence of, like, death not being all that there is. Because, and I'll get into this, and I did not explain that very well, but in Revival, he presents probably the most disturbing representation of the afterlife that I've ever seen. It's cold, it's animalistic, it's pointless, it's terrifying. So the fact that death is not the end, that there is something after death, and it makes death look better. It's the sign of someone that has. It's a different kind of horror. It's a different kind of fear. It's where death, I guess, could be a relief in comparison. It's some morbid stuff. It's some dark thoughts. And it's a little bit more nuanced than just the simple fear of death itself in Pet Sematary. And both books, going back to the comparison, both books, live by Judd Crandall's famous words. Sometimes, Lewis, dead is better. In Pet Sematary, being dead was a preferable option to being resurrected. And then here, being dead is a better option than being slaves of ant creatures. So, like I said, it's just, to me, it was very much still with me, Pet Sematary. So it was no surprise that I was drawing a lot of parallels from Pet Sematary while reading Revival. But that's not in any ways a criticism. Because I just think that in a novel that featured music so prominently, it's no surprise to find Stephen King riffing, right, on some of his old melodies. And just one last thought. It's for someone that has struggled with addiction his entire life. Addiction features prominently in this novel, and not just addiction of drugs. Because our main character, Jamie, is a heroin addict. But make no mistake, addiction is there. So he's addicted to heroin. Charlie's addicted to his own drug, which is to find the truth behind the lightning. And then everyone else is addicted to something else, one way or another, whether it's everyone addicted to the religion, and everyone's a different form of a drug dealer. Charlie, in his many guises, just deals drugs, whether it's salvation, whether it's just when he's preaching. So it's very much on display. And here's the thing about recording this so quickly. I have not had time to really put everything together yet, and to really let it sit and sink. With every other Stephen King book that I've read for the podcast, I've read the books at least 2 times at that point. Some of them, like It, by the time I get to It, I think it's like my 6th time reading the book. But this is, I just have my first go around with it, and I haven't had time to let it process, to let it gel. So I apologize. I'm just kind of throwing things out there without really going into too much detail, because I haven't had much time, and I haven't had the years in between really to let it come together. But regardless, we're almost at a half an hour at this point, and I still haven't even started talking about Revival. So I'm going to start talking about Revival now. So look, Stephen King is he's good. He's good at what he does. If he wasn't good, there would not be something called the Stephen King cast. But he is good, because just look at the opening chapter. Not even the opening chapter. The opening section here. Okay. In one way, at least, our lives really are like movies. The main cast consists of your family and friends. The supporting cast is made up of neighbors, co-workers, teachers, daily acquaintances. There are also bit players, the supermarket checkout girl with pretty smile, the friendly bartender at the local watering hole, the guys you work out with at the gym 3 days a week. And there are thousands of extras, those people who flow through every life like water through a sieve, seen once and never again. The teenager browsing graphic novels at Barnes & Noble, the one you had to slip past murmuring, "Excuse me," in order to get to the magazines. The woman in the next lane at a stoplight, taking a moment to freshen her lipstick. The mother wiping ice cream off her toddler's face in a roadside restaurant where you stop for a quick bite. The vendor who sold you a bag of peanuts at a baseball game. But sometimes a person who fits none of these categories comes into your life. This is the Joker who pops out of the deck at odd intervals over the years, often during a moment of crisis. In the movies, this sort of character is known as the fifth business, or the change agent. When he turns up in a film, you know he's there because the screenwriter put him there. But who is the screenwriter of our lives? Fate or coincidence? I want to believe it's the latter. I want that with all of my heart and soul. When I think of Charles Jacobs, my fifth business, my change agent, my nemesis, I can't bear to believe his presence in my life had anything to do with fate. It would mean that all of these terrible things, these horrors, were meant to happen. If that is so, then there is no such thing as light, and our belief in it is a foolish illusion. If that is so, we live in darkness like animals in a burrow, or ants deep in their hill, and not alone. Okay. How do you put it down? How do you say, no, I think I'm good. I don't want to read any more of this. This is masterful in every way, shape, and form. First of all, in one way, at least, our lives really are like movies. Who hasn't thought of themselves as the main character in their own movie? So right away, this opening line, this opening section speaks to something that I think that we all can say that, oh yeah, I've thought of that. So it makes you go, yeah, all of this is right. The Barnes & Noble person, the cute girl at the checkout, yeah, all of that's something that, that I can relate to that. He's making the connection. And he knows how to hook you. He knows how to sink, his claws into you and pull you close. And then he just starts to twist. So here are all the people in your lives. But then there's one person. There's someone that's going to pop in and out of your life just randomly here and there. And you're never going to figure out why. And hope it's coincidence. Because if it's not coincidence, that means that there's something out there. Most people would love the idea of fate. That there is someone controlling everything because it speaks to a higher power. And our character is saying the exact opposite. And it makes you just want to say, why? What are the horrors? What is so wrong with not being alone? You need to keep on reading here. It's so fascinating. And of course, he mentions, all right, right in that opening, ants in a hill. And of course, that's going to come back in a very, very strong and literal way, in a very, very terrifying way. Now, the person that's narrating to us is Jamie, our main character, and by 4 pages in, we get a really good sense of him and his family. So King, he does a lot, with very little. One way of delivering the information is through, syntax and word choice. It's a story that's narrated by Jamie, whose word choice, especially at the beginning, it's not very verbose. It's not to say that he's unintelligent, but the repeated use of the word guys to refer to the toy soldiers and the fact that he says there was stuff going on, rather than being a little bit more specific, it gives me the impression that he's an everyman kind of quality, right? He's not some intellect, some stuffy academic. He's kind of like just an every guy. And as always, King writes with an authenticity. Nothing on this seems inauthentic. And he's always providing wonderful insights into life. For instance, we get just a great life lesson on page 5 that many of our children could learn from. When Jamie's mother, tells him about playing, with his friends. Because Jamie says, in truth, it seemed unfair to me that I should ever have to lose because they were my soldiers and it was my footlocker. When I advanced this idea to my mother one hot, late summer day shortly after my birthday, she took me by the shoulders and looked into my eyes, a sure sign that I was about to receive another lesson in life. That it's mine business is half the trouble with the world, Jamie. When you play with your friends, the soldiers belong to all of you. That is just, that's great. And actually, what's interesting is that the lesson that Jamie learns from his mother about sharing, by the way, it's repeated a few pages later out of the mouth of Charles Jacobs. And also on page 7, it just cracks me up. He writes, at the age of 6, I put adults into 3 categories: young grown-ups, and old people. Just little things like that. Yes, that's exactly, I imagine, how a 6-year-old sees things. Now, I just mentioned Charles Jacobs. I'm going to talk a lot more about him later on. But with him, King has created just a really different kind of villain here. But he's one that I hope is as enduring as his more famous ones. I'm definitely going to talk about just Charles, specifically Charles, later on towards the end of the podcast. And I'll just be biting my tongue between now and then because I just want to really dive into him. It's a fascinating character. A really fascinating character. When we first meet him, he hunkers down to play with Jamie, who's 6 at the time. Now, at this point, Jamie is hunched over a small mountain he's made for himself, modeled after Goat Mountain, which is where the story will wind up concluding. So already, Stephen King is demonstrating a symmetry to the novel. And after the initial meeting, King provides a modern context onto the past, because he has to here, basically because we have a relationship between, even me saying it sounds perverted, right? There's a relationship between a man and a boy, but there's nothing inappropriate about it. It's just the preacher has come to town. He befriends the young boy. But in the day and age that we live in, immediately red flags go up. So Stephen King is very wise to reference that, and then kind of has fun with the associations that come from it in a very comical way, with Jacobs asking to borrow Mrs. Morton's youngest, and telling Jamie that there's a surprise in the garage he might like to see that his mother can't know about at the moment. But it's harmless at that point. It is so non-threatening. Our modern associations place a danger on it, but at the time, it's not dangerous. But with that said, we can't help but think that something is wrong. I don't know if it's because we're reading a Stephen King novel. I don't know if it's just he's able to imbue a danger, even though there isn't a danger. There's a hint of maybe something could go wrong because he goes into the garage. And I know that I couldn't help but think of the toy soldiers that wound up getting buried alive in the little mountain that Charles had poked holes into. And they were hiding in their caves when it was mud, and then it dried out, and then all the dirt fell onto the soldiers. And so all of a sudden we have our main character now in an enclosed space, and we don't know if the proverbial dirt is going to fall down. There's just, like I said, this feeling of menace and dread, and it permeates these pages. And we shouldn't feel that way, because nothing about Charles at this point reveals any sort of sinister intent whatsoever. At this point in his life, he is completely earnest, completely kind, completely loving. Even later in the novel, the horrors that appear come as a result of his attempts to heal others. So he might wind up becoming monstrous, but to me, he's never a monster. And here in his early days, he's just a man, a really, really good man. And while in the garage, Jacobs reveals his model town, okay, which is so thematically rich here. Okay, so he reveals a model town that he presides over like a god. Okay, so just that in of itself, that's enough to give us where this story can go and if we...
Running a business is hard enough, so why make it harder with a dozen different apps that don't talk to each other? One for sales, another for inventory, a separate one for accounting. Before you know it, you are drowning in software instead of growing your business. This is where Odoo comes in. Odoo is the only business software you'll ever need. It's an all-in-one, fully integrated platform that handles everything. CRM, accounting, inventory, e-commerce, HR, and more. No more app overload. No more juggling logins. Just one seamless system that makes work easier. And the best part, Odoo replaces multiple expensive platforms for a fraction of the cost. It's built to grow with your business, whether you are just starting out or already scaling up. Plus, it's easy to use, customizable, and designed to streamline every process, so you can focus on what really matters, running your business. Thousands of businesses have made the switch, so why not you? Try Odoo for free at odoo.com. That's ODOO.com.
Follow his arc. He's able to create light, right? And he makes Jesus walk across water, okay? And not through any supernatural means, but through tricks and through gadgetry. So here we have a symbolic God whose tricks are revealed to us, okay? He's not Oz the Great and Terrible, but just the man behind the curtain, right? So with this garage scene, it's implied that this is a preacher with less faith than he would like. Someone who is just on the surface, superficially religious. And when you look closer, you see it's a sham, just like Peaceable Lake itself. In his eyes, the whole world is just a pretend world with just tricks, no divinity. Now compare this with the end of the novel. Okay? Again, at the end of the novel, we have Jamie and Charles standing together before another false land. This one ruled not by Charles, but by an otherworldly Lovecraftian creature called Mother. Both of the scenes, the beginning and the end, revolve around Charles revealing the tricks of the world. To the boy, Jamie, he reveals the secrets that make Peaceable Lake seem like heaven. In the end, he reveals the secrets of Null, which make death very hellish. In both scenes, first with Peaceable Lake, and later, our existence is proved to be nothing but a sham. So it really comes as no surprise that we learn that he's fired 3 years after arriving to town, right? And when Jamie's description of the events leading up to the terrible sermon, they're beautifully ominous, with lines like, "I remember the sunsets as red as the blood on my father's knuckles." He describes his friend losing his hand, the destruction of his father's road rocket, the loss of the postman's son's eye, and of his brother's voice. So keep in mind that we have the loss of sight, touch, and sound. And with the dwindling attendance at church, we have a loss of faith, which is again personified within Jacobs, who uses a great visual of electrified balloons to illustrate the power of sin. But still, okay, it's just a flashy trick. And who manipulates the electricity? It's not God, it's Jacobs. It's the balloons that the kids remember. The electrified Jacob's ladder that he shows them. As a preacher and a teacher, he's memorable for his flash, not for his content. Okay? He himself is one of his own tricks. A little bit empty and hollow. Okay? Now that's just one perspective. Okay? And I'm not... So I'm saying these things, and keep in mind that also he's a good man at this point. All right? King is setting the stage for his downfall. And you can tell that there's a curiosity that he has there that's going to completely undo him. But regardless, he's still, I think, at this point, supposed to be a good man. The kids love him. You know, he is trying to teach them about God. I'm pulling from the text and focusing on this fact that, you know, he is more concerned with the science, I would say, than the faith. But that's just one perspective. The other perspective is that with the electricity and his belief in the electricity and his fascination with it, he represents a new age, right? One of enlightenment and of science. It's a different kind of wonder than the pure religious awe. In his sermons, he marries the concept of electricity with the power of God rather than adopting, a more basic either-or stance. This shows him to be progressive, thoughtful, balanced, just like his wife, who's a believer in the power of the youth, playing Beatles songs on the organ along with classic hymns. Songs, okay, that are frowned upon by the more traditional townsfolk. Combined, these two are a healthy, vibrant, and beautiful couple, the complete opposite of the previous minister and his wife. Here, we have a clash of ideologies, the old way combating the new way as personified by the Jacobs, with the children caught in the middle. And what happens? He is run out of town because of his beliefs. Granted, by the time he leaves town, he's soured on the belief of God, but I think that the idea of a older generation resisting a new age is a valid reading of the text. I think that it's there. But going back to his fascination with electricity, we learn that he's this inventor. And through his invention, he brings back Conrad's voice. He does. It's not the power of God. And if one were to believe in a vengeful God, Charles's hubris is met with the death of his wife and his child. That's one way of looking at it. Or because he's used the secret electricity, which comes from a superpower that charges the universe on the karmic wheel, he might wind up getting punished from it. He has taken from the universe, and now the universe takes from him what he should never have taken in the first place. So the manner of the death itself of his wife and child is reminiscent of the force of this chaotic force. And again, from Pet Sematary. And again, I was just reading Pet Sematary. I'm going to go way more into this in Pet Sematary. But, it's a meaningless death. That's what happens in Pet Sematary. It's what happens here, both because of a car, right? As I stated earlier, both novels deal with the loss of a child. But in Pet Sematary, the death is presented as a flashback. We're not as much focused on the death. When Gage dies, we're focused more on the process of mourning and what death means when we are still alive. There's a distance there, and King focuses on just the machine of life, trying to make us process what the death is. Whereas here we see it very, very raw. It's brutal. Charles sees his child Morris and screams, "Where's his face? Where's my little boy's face?" And this might be, to me, the most disturbing thing that King has ever put to paper. The vulnerability, this tragedy, it's going to resonate throughout the rest of the novel. And to me, no matter what Charles does, at his core, he's the father who had to see his baby mangled. And so I'm not excusing him, but I think that it creates a sympathetic character through and through. So, ultimately, the tragedy utterly destroys whatever spiritualism that was in the man. And in the next chapter, King teases the terrible sermon, which has lived on in the years after it occurred with a mythology all of its own. Now, by the time that we see Jacob step up to the pulpit, it's been solidified in our minds, the very idea of it. And when Jacob begins speaking, outpours complete blasphemy in the house of God, a scathing indictment of our belief system, which boils down to the following quote on page 73. "Religion is the theological equivalent of a quick buck insurance scam where you pay your premium year after year, and then when you need the benefits you paid for so religiously, you discover that the company took your money does not in fact exist." And as he leaves, he does so with a sermon of his own religion, the one based around his belief in electricity, which, unlike religion, faith, and God, is a force of nature he can understand and control. If you want a power greater than yourselves, look to the lightning. 1 billion volts in each strikes, 100,000 amperes of current, and temperatures of 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit. There is a higher power in that, I grant you, but here in this building, no. Believe what you want, but I tell you this, behind St. Paul's darkened glass, there is nothing but a lie. With this speech, we know he has to leave. His goodbye to Jamie is heartbreaking. although it's a Stephen King story, at this point, there hasn't been a glimmer of supernatural whatsoever. At this point, it's more in the vein of like the human drama as seen in, let's say, different seasons. The goodbye is genuine. The teacher having to say goodbye to the student. The surrogate father parting from the only son he has left. Just two friends never see each other. And looking back in this scene, in a way, even though they meet again, it's not the same. You know, the next time they meet, both will have lost their innocence. They will meet again as strangers. And this is a genuine goodbye from the versions of themselves that will never exist again. You know, there will be a resurrection, a revival of the relationship. And like the resurrected dead in Pet Sematary, each time it's revived, it comes back a little bit less, a little bit more corrupt each time. You know, and the result of the terrible sermon isn't just that it forces Jacobs to leave town, but it provides a lesson in Jacob's most faithful disciple, Jamie. He turns on his belief, and it's no surprise that in God's absence, he turns not just to a guitar, but to an electric guitar. With the inclusion of the guitar, okay, King begins his musings on the musician, what it means and feels like to make music. Now, until now, King has been content to include music into his works and to describe the power that comes from listening to it and letting it fill you up. But as far as I remember, and I could be wrong, let me know if I'm wrong, but I believe this is the first time he casts a musician as the protagonist. You know, through Jamie, he's able to explore sensations and thoughts that I'm sure he's felt and bottled up for years. Now, if you don't know, you know, King has been a longtime band member of the Rock Bottom Remainders. And of course, rock and roll wouldn't be complete without its two co-conspirators, sex and drugs. And Jamie's adolescence is defined by music, and with it comes the love from Astrid and later the drug addiction itself. Now, when we get into the parts where Jamie starts to be a heroin addict, the novel itself, it becomes an interesting companion piece to Dr. Sleep. Which is a recent novel in which he was able to explore the road to sobriety. Now here he turns back on that path and heads down that road in order to look in on the sensation of addiction again, you know, which has been seen in many of his works before. And while on this road that he takes Jamie down, that road meets him back with Jacobs, right, at a small town fair. Is it coincidence? Is it fate? Are they charged particles drawn together? It's never fully explored how they keep coming back. Jacobs thinks that it's destiny. Jamie hopes it's otherwise. Regardless, Jacobs rediscovers Jamie at Jamie's completely lowest point, and now more of a mad scientist than a preacher, he cures Jamie's heroin addiction with the magic of electricity. Now, I gotta say, so at that point in the novel, I found myself less and less interested in taking notes for this podcast and just more and more interested in reading the damn book. You know, because at this point, I can't guess where the story's going to go, what King is going to say, or what's going to happen with the characters. Rereading Stephen King's books up until this point has just made me forget the experience of reading a King book for a first time. You know, all of the Kingisms aside, all of the traits and tropes and tricks, and like everything I said before, there's an unpredictability. All right, his characters are never safe, you know, as are, say, Dean Koontz's characters. And that's not a knock on Dean Koontz. Like many Stephen King fans, when they first get into Stephen King fans, they look in the aisle, and after, you know, K.I., shortly after is, you know, K.O., and, you know, Dean Koontz, you know, tends to go hand in hand a lot of times with Stephen King, so a lot of people that read Stephen King go on to read Dean Koontz. And I'm a huge Dean Koontz fan. There's many people out there that love Dean Koontz and cannot get into Stephen King. So I'm not knocking Dean Koontz, but in the majority of his works, there's a lot of his characters are safe. All right, there's an unpredictability to Stephen King's works where there's more of a danger, and I don't know what's going to happen here when I'm reading this. I don't have the privilege of having read the books. This particular book already, like I have with every other Stephen King novel almost every other Stephen King novel, with the exception of Blaze and a couple short stories here and there. I've read everything else. But this, going back, it was just so exciting. And so when I read, a Stephen King book for the podcast, I've got my book in one hand pretty much, and then my phone in the other, and I take notes on the phone. And here I just found myself not really using the phone. I kept putting the phone down. I just kept getting soaked up into the book, and I just needed to just get into it. I just needed to just say, I didn't want to say screw the podcast, but just let the book be a book for a while, and then I can go back and take care of my thoughts, and it brought me back, with this electric trick, with the cure of the heroin, Jamie's belief that something has taken over him with the electricity, and the idea of him saying over and over again, something happened. I remembered reading Stephen King's books for the first time, and having to slow my eyes down from skipping over words so I could just keep on going, get to the next page. So anyway, I needed to just read for a while and kind of just shut my brain off and just let it be a thing. But going back to the story, when Jacob leaves Jamie behind, it's hard not to compare it to when they first part ways. It's emotional. They say, I love you. There's tears. Here, it's cold. All right? It's just a note, and then he's gone, and that's it. And then years later, when Hugh and Jamie swap stories about Jacobs, Hughes references the prismatics in his vision and the belief that he was looking through the world into another, more real world. Our world, in that case, is the darkened glass through which we peer during life, as referenced in Jacob's early sermons, and specifically referenced in the Terrible Sermon. And at the revival, Hugh sees clearly that into the other world, right? And he sees, when he's looking through, he sees that those that have been affected by Charles have been replaced with humanoid ants. And I'm going to get to the ants later, but it's just such a strong image, and it's terrifying, and, of course, when Jamie researches the recipients of his healing, he discovers the horrific side effects which have led to madness and death. So King, in the beginning of the novel, it's just full-on human emotion and human drama, and then now he's really starting to get into that supernatural side that he does so well. And you just need to keep on reading to see what is going on with these people that that Charles has cured here, because clearly he hasn't cured them. Something's going on. What is going on, and why does one of the people that's been cured see ant people? It's crazy, and. There's such, and a lot of, our ideas of revivals and the tent shows, there's an insidiousness that's there. There's that idea that I think that we have of just the charlatan, making money and exploiting people. And so that's there. And Stephen King is able to use that, and draw that out. And that's the basis of this story. He built, the entire character of Charles off of, it's a part of him, off of that idea of the traveling preacher, the evangelical preacher just taking advantage of others, and so it's no surprise that Jamie wants to confront him about it. And earlier in the novel, Charles had referenced books that were hard to obtain, and we learned that they weren't books about electricity, but specifically one book that first appeared in the 1978 collection of short stories, specifically the short story Jerusalem's Lot. The book that was difficult for Jacob Charles to obtain is De Vermis Mysterious, which translates into The Mystery of the Worm. Okay, now this makes perfect sense. In the short story Jerusalem's Lot, which I reviewed in the Night Shift review, it involves a small town whose religion turned sour, its preacher converting his parishioners into worshippers of an H.P. Lovecraft monstrosity, a giant worm god that lived underneath the church. And here with this novel, we have a corrupted priest whose interest in the very same book brings forth not a worm god, but alien ant-like creatures. And of course, as we'll get into later on, a monstrous Lovecraftian mother. Now he's going to later reveal that this book is only one of 6 forbidden books. But how fun is it that Stephen King revisits and expands upon a minor plot point in a short story he published 36 years ago? 36. I'm not even 36. Okay? This type of continuity, this level of prolificacy, it's astounding. I can't even imagine. It is difficult to sit down and finish one book or one short story. But to be able to have the ability to just churn out so many that you've built up such a rich tapestry of an interconnected universe that you're able to pull out one little thing that you did 36 years before and turn it, into a plot point in your newest novel and have it make sense for that original story and have it make sense for this. It's just, I'm in awe of that kind of thing. Now we've seen Charles Jacobs devolve and devolve and devolve, and later Jamie is forced into a confrontation when Jacobs, he basically, he went from a good man into, kind of a charlatan, into kind of a sleazeball, into a full-blown mustache-twirling villain, capturing Astrid to be used as bait. The only thing he doesn't do is tie her down to the railroad tracks, but that's basically, what happens here is he just uses her to get Jamie to him. And that does allow for a reunion between Astrid and Jamie. And it's not presented here with any false romanticism. As I've said before, King always keeps it authentic. It has a reality that includes her looking horrendously old. And it's funny to talk about reality when discussing a book about magic lightning and ant aliens, but it would have been too much of a suspension of disbelief if she had been beautiful, if it was played as a long lost love, reuniting. There's tenderness there, and that's natural, and they eventually kiss, and King writes, there were no embers in the ashes, but we were tied together just the same. And that kind of truthfulness, he doesn't touch upon it much, but what he touches upon is poignant. That two people who shared a moment in time, over a period of months and years that are eclipsed in the time that they spent apart, still shared something, and it will always be there. And for this moment, they can go back to it for a second. Now, at this point in their lives, doesn't mean anything, but it meant something once, and that means something. And that is so much more nuanced than just having them have just been in love with each other forever, but just distanced, So, when Jacobs administers the cure, it starts to get creepy, and it gets from this point forward, the book gets really good. Astrid hypnotically refers to the door in the wall, the one covered with dead ivy above the broken city. It's a small line, but it's so creepy. It's a hint of another world, and it fits in perfectly with the writing of the man whom King quoted in the very beginning of the book, and that's H.P. Lovecraft. Okay, the opening line is one that he also references later on in the text, and that is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die, by H.P. Lovecraft. So H.P. Lovecraft, for those of you who don't know, was an author in the early 1900s, or not necessarily in the early 1900s, but in the 1900s. And he the focus of H.P. Lovecraft was his biggest legacy is Cthulhu, which is basically an otherworldly god. So he wrote of the old ones, these monstrous alien gods that existed before time itself and lay slumbering. And their existence is something beyond our comprehension. And in all of his stories that are pretty much written in the first person perspective, his characters, which tend to be academic types, go off in search of something, and in this search, or in their research, they come across fragments of an ancient time, or they come across an aspect of one of these ancient gods, and ultimately always drives them to madness, because their little human brains can't comprehend the vastity, the vastness, and the alien coldness and indifference of these gods, and their existence disproves the idea that we have held about what gods mean to us, and how involved a god is in our lives, and has created us and cares for us, and will welcome us after our deaths. The presence of these and the existence of these gods, as just being alien creatures that will never understand and will never care about us, drives people to madness. And so that is what he's doing here. That is what Stephen King is doing. In fact, King even states that in his novel, The Mystery of the Worm, that book, it's the inspiration for Lovecraft's very, very iconic Necronomicon, which is the cursed book. And I'll get back into Lovecraft later on, when I start to discuss the end of the story a little bit more. But just King, look, it's just fascinating here, because he's just, at this point in his life, he's not interested at all in one-note characters. Jamie, I'm not saying that he ever was, but it's very, very clear here. Jamie isn't good with a capital G, and Charlie isn't evil with a capital E. In earlier novels, his good guys were good, and his bad guys were iconically evil, right? Now, of course, there were always shades of gray, but there's pretty much, it's all gray here. It's very, very muddy. Back in the day, we had Barlow and Straker. They were just simply evil incarnate. There was no need for backstory or sympathy. You had Christine, you had Roland LeBay, you had the forces in the Indian burial ground in Pet Cemetery, Randall Flagg, the Man in Black, Pennywise, Overlook, the possessed Jack Torrance. But now he's come to a point in his career where he's told those stories. And he knows that life is much more complex than that. As Charlie devolves spiritually and morally, I can't help but think of the father just screaming about his son's missing face. No matter how far he goes, I can't forget that charming man who loved his family, his parishioners, and the young boy that he befriended. And Jamie, in his later years, becomes a hero. Yes, he does, but he spent a good chunk of it as a selfish junkie. And he's only reformed because of the work of his now adversary, his one-time friend, the man he cried over and to he professed his love. Their relationship is complex, it's messy, it's tragic. And Jamie, though he wants to ultimately stop Charles, he makes the decision to stay, not because of a sense of righteousness, but because he wants to witness Charlie as he opens Pandora's box. Right? So it's not some valiant hero on a hill waving a sword in front of the dragon. It's much, much more complex than that. And he wants to stick around for the end. He needs to see now. So much has happened. He has gone through so much. He is now part of this. He has researched everyone that has been corrupted by the cure, that he just needs to know. He needs to know what Charlie's been up to. He needs to know what the end goal is. He just needs to see it. He doesn't need to stop it. He needs to see it. He needs to see the end. And King teases the end for about 100 pages or so, ending sections beautifully with ominous cliffhangers and dread-filled portents. Now, by the time they're ready for the apocalyptic lightning storm, the novel has gleefully transformed into a throwback horror story of a mad scientist trapped, in an old castle up on the hill, and the unlucky assistant in the vein of Jonathan Harker, right, from Dracula. Now, with the lightning storm, okay, King is able to take one of horror's oldest tropes, lightning and rain to set the tone, and weaves it organically into the story. It would be lazy if it wasn't so clever. And as the end approaches and the lightning flashes and the storm rages above them, like a true villain, Charlie refuses to reveal his plan in full, instead speaking around it, teasing Jamie about the secret power of the universe, before launching into a monologue on page 366 and 367, which spells out his philosophy on life as an older man, whereas the terrible sermon had summarized his life as a younger man in at the beginning of the path that led them to here. So he writes, "We spoke of a certain door. It's the door into death, and sooner or later each one of us grows small, reduced to nothing but mind and spirit, and in that reduced state we pass through, leaving our bodies behind like empty gloves. Sometimes death is natural, a mercy that puts an end to suffering. But all too often it comes as an assassin, full of senseless cruelty and lacking any vestige of compassion. My wife and son, taken in a stupid and pointless accident, are perfect examples. Your sister is another. They are 3 of millions. For most of my life, I've railed against those who try to explain that stupidity and pointlessness with prattlings about faith and children's stories about heaven. Such nonsense never comforted me, and I'm sure it never comforted you. And yet, there is something. In my experiments, I've glimpsed intimations of that something. I've seen its shape in every cure the secret electricity has affected. I even know it from the after effects, some of which you have noted. Those are trailing fragments of some unknown existence beyond our lives. Everyone wonders at one time or another what lies beyond the wall of death. Today, Jamie, we'll see for ourselves. I want to know what happened to my wife and son. I want to know what the universe has in store for all of us once this life is over, and I intend to find out." Now, he eventually spills the beans on his plan, right? To resurrect the dead. And he's a modern-day Frankenstein! And the title of the novel becomes head-smackingly clear. How could I have not figured this out? He's a mad scientist obsessed with lightning. How could I have not guessed that his goal would be to bring somebody back from the dead? And I can't help but think that King chuckled to himself when he wrote the words, "She's alive!" and "She lives!" King smartly alludes to, during this whole section, to Captain Ahab, right? It just makes perfect sense. Because the entirety of the novel, Charlie is chasing his white whale. Now, I mentioned, him bringing someone back from the dead, and it's Mary Faye, character that we didn't know who the character was until the very, very end. But when Mary Faye is revived, with the revival of Mary Faye, King does his best H.P. Lovecraft imitation, and he does it well. In fact, he goes one step further. So I had mentioned earlier about the how basically the elder gods, these giant beings that exist out there, they're aliens, right? But these creatures, these Lovecraftian creatures in King's works, they're worse here because they just don't exist in our space. They just don't exist in our universe. They exist not just beyond a universe. It's insinuated here that they're the ones that rule the afterlife. And the afterlife that is presented here is terrifying. Of the most terrifying things that I've seen Stephen King write. Because it's so vast and so cold and so Lovecraftian. Like I said, he's doing a great Lovecraft impersonation. It's very, very effective. It's not the first time he's done it. He's kind of tackled Lovecraft before. But here, this is some powerful, disturbing concepts and imagery. So he just presents this blasted world. This horrible like nothing world with cold alien stars, and they're not stars, they're just spaces. They're spaces where the ancient ones live behind, and this world, everyone's dead, and they're ruled over by these ant humanoid things that beat them and bite the humans and eat the humans. It's so disturbing. And then, okay, so I'm starting to kind of grasp that, and I'm like, okay, this is messed up. This is a concept. You die and this is what happens to you. Like there's been so many versions of what happens to you after you die. Congratulations, Stephen King. You just came up with a brand new one that is truly terrifying. And then all of a sudden, from the spaces between the stars, which is a well, Stephen King doesn't write it that way. It comes in one of the voids of the stars, but the spaces between the stars is something that H.P. Lovecraft. It was one of the H.P. Lovecraftisms. All right, we have Stephen Kingisms. This was an H.P. Lovecraftism, which is a great concept because you look up, you see in the sky, you see the stars, which are just points of light, right? So existence of just something out there, and so the spaces between the stars are just so void and black. And if you think about the ending of True Detective, you've seen True Detective, and they have Rust Cole and Martin Hart. They have a conversation pretty much around the same thing. But whereas it's more positive in the end, the way I look at it, the light's winning. Here in Lovecraft works, it's not positive. It's very, very pessimistic that there's so much blackness out there. There's so much space. There's so much darkness, and there's things out there, things that live in the darkness between the stars. All right, so the space between the stars, and that's also something that has been taken and used from an H.P. Lovecraft aficionado by the name of Brian Lumley, who is another horror author out there. Anyway, so Stephen King, he goes on full disturbing mode, and he has the creature known as Mother, and we don't see her, we just see her leg, all right, and her leg comes out, and it's black, and it's tiny has tines on it, and its claws are human faces, okay? That is horrifying, right? And then the Mother starts to come towards Jamie and them, and as that's occurring, the revived Mary Faye has a thing come out of her mouth, and it's the face of Charles's son, which comes full circle here, because when he started off on this path, what led him down the path was the fact that he couldn't see his son's face anymore. What happened to my son's face? Now, many, many years later, here is his son's face. He turned his back on God because God had, done this to his son and ripped his son's face off. He took his face away, his identity. And then now, in the perversion of all of it, his new God has returned his son's face in the worst possible way. So again, the symmetry is very, very effective. And so ultimately what all of this is about, it's not just about this Lovecraftian creature. What it is, it's about death, right? So Mother represents death. This is the land of the dead. This is Null. Mother is the ruler of all of death. So it's death. And how does our main character win the day? He renounces the concept of death. He screams no. He looks at this cold, vast, indifferent thing that doesn't care about us, that's going to take all of us away, and says, no, I reject you. And it pushes her back, and then he's able to shoot Mary Faye and save himself. He's haunted for the rest of his life, but he does push back against death. So ultimately, it's a novel just about a man's obsession, Charles, his addiction with finding answers about death, about the afterlife, about finding what's on the other side. And it's about our protagonist who sees that and rejects it, and says, this is not for me. You're not going to beat me. I'm going to live my life. Which ultimately, it's dark. It's a dark novel. But with that there, that he rejects it, that to me, that speaks to the optimism in Stephen King's works. Okay, we're over an hour now. I don't want to spend too much longer, but I really want to talk about Charles Jacobs here. Okay? Look, with this guy, King has done it again. he has created yet another memorable, charismatic villain. And I would say he's right up there with his A-listers, such as Pennywise and Randall Flagg. In fact, speaking about, Randall Flagg, he says, "Let there be light," a phrase uttered by the Man in Black at the conclusion of The Gunslinger. But ultimately, how can you not like him? How can you not like this guy? In the beginning, on our first meeting, he spends time playing with Jamie and his toys. He demonstrates a patience with kids, a childlike sense of wonder, and an ability to play. But keep in mind that the first time we do meet him, and I mentioned this earlier, he pushes his fingers into the mole, into the hill, right? So he's impressing himself. He's pushing himself. It's a violation of a sort, right? And his good intentions cause unwanted destruction. And also, upon our first meeting, our first time meeting him, there's two descriptions of how he blocks the light. It's a small but important character trait, because he's a preacher who should be generating light, but instead robs it. All right, it's a symbolic foreshadowing of what will come. And then with Charles's demonstration of how to make the caves in the mud, King calls back to the despair and dread found within the opening page of the novel, when Jamie writes, "We live in darkness like animals in a burrow, or ants deep in their hill." The hill that he pushes fingers into, effectively trapping the soldiers, thematically resonates through the entire novel. He meant to do well, but he didn't think the mud would dry and cave in. Just like through his cures, he thought he was going to do a good job. He thought he was doing a good deed, but he didn't realize that his cures had sinister after effects. And the hill itself, it's similar to an anthill, right? And it foreshadows the type of creature that will haunt our characters upon the conclusion of this novel. Perhaps the city, King writes at the end of the novel, wasn't a city at all, but a kind of anthill where the dead of the earth were first enslaved, then eaten. Going back to Charlie, he's progressive, right? He's a man of science, as much a disciple of Ben Franklin as he is Jesus, worshiping the power of electricity, with more inner wonder and curiosity than he does the Bible. He brings the town to the concept of the future. He's a music man, right? Like the music man, and even predicts the evolution of television from antennas to wires to satellites. So for Jacobs, electricity is a power that's been taken for granted as much as God's power is. The difference, of course, is that he sees himself as the wielder of electricity rather than its conduit. If electricity and God's powers are connected, and if electricity is just an extension of the divine, then Jacob's obsession has created his own hubris, his tragic flaw, turning the good-natured, well-intentioned agent of change into a fallen angel, he who thought that he was equal to the Lord. But with that said, he gives beautiful descriptions about electricity throughout this novel, which are just as beautiful as the sermons that he gives. Well, basically the best sermons that he gives are all about electricity. And his transformation is so fascinating to watch, beginning as a man of faith to a stage magician to an evangelical preacher, who until at the end he's just the mad scientist, and as the preacher, he enjoys at that point praying at his congregation, and then I don't know exactly how Stephen King feels about religion. I know that he believes in the good in humanity, and I know that he believes in what faith can provide to people. I know that he likes to believe that there's something out there. I don't know how he feels about organized religion, but I feel as though the revival scene, if he has any contempt or any questions or any criticisms, he expresses them through the revival scenes. And then ultimately, we get at the heart of Charlie, who on page 373, he pretty much just lays it on the line. He gives his motivation for the entire novel at this point. You know, he is just so far removed from the man that he once was. And he's villainous at this point. You know, at the heart of every established religion is one sacred mystery that supports belief and induces fidelity, even to the point of martyrdom. Did he want to know what lay beyond death's door? Yes. But he wanted more. I believe this with all my heart. Was to violate that mystery. To drag it into the light and hold it up screaming, "Here it is! What all your crusades and murder in the name of God were for. Here it is! And how do you like it?" You know, it's a way of him wanting to take credit, wanting to put himself in front of something that's greater than he is, to put himself on the same pedestal as something greater than he is. So that's Charlie. You know, I think that the only way that he is going to stand toe-to-toe with some of Stephen King's more iconic villains is if a movie gets made and he gets cast well and the movie does well and it's an iconic role for that particular character. This could be a fantastic movie, by the way, and this could be a great role for an actor out there, because there's so many different versions of this character that he would get to play. The innocent man in the beginning, you know, the stage magician, the evangelist, and the mad scientist. That's fun. That. I mean, think about all the variety that someone could have with this novel, and they could if it was a movie, and they could sink their teeth into it. So, Stephen King fans out there, write in and tell me who you think would do a great job with this. Let me know. I don't really have an idea myself, but I would definitely like to hear yours. So now we've come to the time of the podcast where I want to talk about the Stephen Kingisms, which are tricks and traits and tropes of Stephen King's works, as found here. The first, I would say, number one, is the number 19. All right, we see it written on the side of Jamie's father's road rocket, and the number 19 is a number that Stephen King uses to great importance in the Dark Tower saga. It is a very important number in his own life. So when he wrote the number 19 here, it was very, very intentional. Number two, preachers with a crisis of faith. So here we have Charles Jacobs. The first time he played with this particular trope was with Father Callahan in Salem's Lot. So this is definitely not the first time that we have seen this, and thankfully Father Callahan's story was not nearly as tragic as Charles Jacobs. Number three is car accidents. Unfortunately, car accidents are something that occur again and again and again in Stephen King's works. From the Dead Zone, of course, there's Christine. You know, there's the evil car. There's Pet Sematary. There's the Gunslinger. So I mean, it's something that we see. There's Dreamcatcher. It's over and over and over again in his real life and here in Revival. Number four, it's a sad one. It's the death of a child. We've definitely seen that before in Stephen King's works. We've seen it prominently in Cujo and Pet Sematary. Number five, connection to Stephen King's other works. So we have a couple examples here. Castle Rock features prominently in this novel. Derry is referred to. The town Harlow itself is referenced in Under the Dome because this town is close to Chester's Mills. Chester's Mill, right? It's Chester's Mill. That's the name of the town, which is the town in Under the Dome. So again, this is Stephen King, and I kind of go more into this in my review of Pet Sematary, kind of talking about the interconnectedness and how to put it all together, because they're all connected, right? But it's not as It's not as neat as they're all living on the same Earth. This is where we have multiple Earths here, because there's never a reference to the town filled with vampires of Jerusalem's Lot, or even Jerusalem's Lot itself. I don't think that there was a vampire issue running around, so it might take place in a universe where there was, the Mystery of the Worm was in a town known as Jerusalem's Lot in the 1700s, but it never wound up becoming revitalized and then taken over by vampires in the 1970s. And I don't think that there was a town near Harlow known as Chester's Mills that had a giant dome that surrounded it, because that's something that I'm sure would come up in the events of revival. But Castle Rock is there. Castle Rock is, we definitely spent some time in Castle Rock, and as you know, that's, hey, in Stephen King's land, that's our home away from home. And in a nice little Easter egg joke here, Jamie's first band is known as the Gunslingers, right? But they don't stay as the Gunslingers very long. They move over to the Chrome Roses. So, of course, any Stephen King fan out there knows the relationship between Gunslingers and Roses. And then, there's a reference to Joyland. And I was definitely waiting for that reference to come, because I knew there was going to be a reference to Joyland. Joyland, for those of you who don't know, it's a recent Stephen King novel. It is a good book. Capital G, capital B. So if you like Shawshank Redemption and you like The Body, which is what Stand By Me is adapted from, you're going to like Joyland. I think that if they made Joyland into a movie and it was done right, I think that it would round out a thematic trilogy. So of course, like, he mentions Joyland because Charlie works at Joyland for a while. So our next Stephen Kingism is supernatural nightmares, which we have time and time again in Christine, The Shining, Pet Sematary. It basically, in every one of his works, his characters have supernatural nightmares. We have the catchphrase here with something happened. That's Stephen King loves the catchphrase. And we have at one point Jamie thinking life is a wheel, which it is just so close to Stephen King's very famous Dark Tower phrase, "Ka is a wheel." So this cannot be a coincidence. It has to be on purpose. Our next Stephen Kingism, gifts with a catch attached to them, right? As seen most famously in Needful Things. And homages, I would say, to his literary heroes. We have H.P. Lovecraft, clearly. But we also have Ray Bradbury. At one point, even Charles admits that he went by the name Mr. Electrico and said, "I named it after Ray Bradbury." And there's one other person that I see a lot of influence on Stephen King. And it's not someone that Stephen King read growing up or was an influence in his early years, but rather was one that was an influence in his later years. And that's his son, Joe Hill. Reading this with The Doorway and the mysteries beyond the doorway, and I was just getting a real Lock and Key vibe. And if those of you who haven't gone out and read Lock and Key, please do. It's a comic book written by his son, Joe Hill. But everything with the sermons and his what he's doing here with religion, it just, to me, having just reread Horns again by Joe Hill, I'm just seeing some thematic connections there. And the two of them have written together before, a couple of short stories. And I think that they they play off each other really well. And rumor has it that Joe Hill really helped shape the ending to 11/22 63, which is one of Stephen King's best endings, hands down. If you haven't read that book, really good book, great ending. And if Joe Hill is responsible for the part that I think that he's responsible for, which I think that he is, it just makes me love Joe Hill even more. But I really do think that later in life, Stephen King is a little bit influenced by the works of his son, which I think is a great compliment to Joe Hill. And I really want to see the two of them sit down and do a Stephen King, Peter Straub styled book, where they just collaborate on a book and just co-write together, because I really want to see what the two of them are able to do. That would be great. And then with the with this other world with Mother, we see glimpses of works from Stephen King. I mean, Mother herself, she's this giant, and we don't see much of her, but like we have all these insect creatures. We have this giant insect leg. It's very much reminiscent of the monsters that came out of The Mist. With the swirling colors behind everything, it made me think of the strange aurora borealis in The Langoliers, and the oil slick in the short story The Raft. So this novel, definitely has little glimmers of previous Stephen King works, and whether it's intentional or not, and whether Stephen King is clearly referencing these other things, or if these are just Stephen King, it's just a Stephen Kingism, and this is it's kind of tropes that he goes back to. I don't know, but they're definitely there. And just the ant creatures made me think of Rose Madder. There's definitely a scene where there's an insectile creature in Rose Madder that made me think of this book. So we're at an hour and a half, everybody, and I need to wrap up. This was one of my more rambling, less focused episodes, but I really wanted to just get it out there while it was really, really fresh. I really enjoyed reading it. I really like this book. I think it's a good book, and at just over 400 pages. It's 403 pages. It's lean. It's mean. It doesn't go on for too long. I have a friend right now who's reading it, and he referred to it as exhausting because his descriptions just go on and on and on. And he doesn't have that here with Revival. It just gets to the point, and to the point where I think that it might be a little like he could have given a little bit more description. I would have liked to have spent more time with Charles in every single one of his incarnations. I thought he was such a charismatic villain. I would have liked to have seen more of him. And but hey, we got 400 pages, and it was 400 good pages. I'm really, really happy with it. But as I was saying, one last thing, I'm glad that I remembered. Stephen King, like I said, his villains earlier were just villainous. And Charlie is different. He has that backstory, and it keeps him sympathetic even through the end. And I think that that's the kind of villain that he tells now. And I think that, even though I haven't gotten there yet, I remember reading The Dark Tower, Book 7, Dark Tower. There's a character in there who could have just been pure evil, but was not. And I'll get to that later. And I'm not even going to do a Dark Tower discussion afterwards because I just need to wrap up. But those of you who have read The Dark Tower, there's a character that is introduced in The Dark Tower, Book 7, that follows our main character over the landscape trying to get to him. And I think that an earlier Stephen King would have presented that character as pure evil. But this Stephen King, the older Stephen King, gave him more pathos and really explored the humanity within that character that was barely human and was very insectile, to actually go back to the whole insectile stuff within this novel. And I remember being really frustrated because I didn't want this character to be whiny. I wanted this character to be pure evil. I wanted him to be a monster. And looking back at it now, that to me kind of signaled a shift in the villains of Stephen King from this point forward, where we got a little bit more sympathy from them. Even as recently in Doctor Sleep with Rose the Hat, who just wanted to live, ultimately. Like, she was a psychic vampire that was just feeding off of people with The Shining, but she just wanted to live. You know, she wasn't a monster. She was just one step up on the ladder of evolution that could eat the energies from people like Danny Torrance, but she wanted to live, right? She wasn't some supernatural evil creature. She just wanted to be and live her life. So that, and we have Charles Jacobs here, someone that went on to do monstrous things. But all of the things that he wound up doing was ultimately because he couldn't handle the fact that his wife that he loved and his son that he loved died. So I think that at this point in his career, Stephen King doesn't care about the pure evil, capital P, capital E, which is fascinating. So he has a couple more books coming out. You know, he has The Bazaar of Dreams, his short story collection, coming out in the spring, I believe. And then he'll have the sequel to Mr. Mercedes, which I am not looking forward to. But Bazaar of Dreams I am, and I want to see if he continues exploring this idea of villains as more sympathetic characters. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I gotta go. It's getting late. I have to work tomorrow, and we're pushing an hour 40 minutes here. So I'm sorry that this episode bogarted the Dark Tower 1, the Gunslinger review. Those of you that were excited, but I promise you part 1 will come out next week. And so I hope to see you here next week. In the meantime, please feel free to write in at stephenkingcast@yahoo.com.
And may you have long days and pleasant nights, and I'll see you here next week where MOON spells Stephen King Cast.